Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cinema Mancuso, and this is Notes on the News. I'm Peter Mancuso, and this is the show where I break down the biggest stories in film, media, and entertainment and give you my thoughts. If you're joining us live, super happy to have you. If at any point during the show you have any comments or questions about any of the topics I'm covering, feel free to drop them in the chat. I'll try to keep an eye on those as best as I can, and maybe we can kind of get a conversation going. If you're watching this after the fact, still super happy to have you. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button, as is my obligation to tell you all. It really does help with helping other people find the channel, so it really would be a huge help. So why don't we just jump in and get started? Also, I apologize. I just scarfed down, a bunch of chicken nuggets. I got home from work late. There was subway issues, so my nose is kind of running from the heat of the nuggets. So anyway, okay. Give me 1 second. I want to try to fix I'm getting an error message or that the stream is struggling, but hopefully it's good enough. Okay. All right, so let's take a look at the box office from this past weekend. The total domestic box office from the weekend was $64 million, so only a 3% drop, so it's pretty much held more or less where it was last week, which is good, but obviously you want to keep seeing it grow, especially as we move into, this is prime box office real estate. I think I just read that this is the 5-year anniversary of Avengers Endgame coming out. So in that, and Infinity War kind of made the last weekend of April a really big box office event. But obviously post-COVID, that's not really held. So the only really things opening this weekend, again, still pretty modest openings, all things considered. So coming in at number 1, we have the film Challengers with Zendaya, kind of this psychosexual thriller about this tennis player and this love triangle and stuff. I've heard really, really great things. I'm going to see it, I think, later this week. And I'm really excited, and it was able to, despite it being a very modest opening at only $15 million, it did open at number 1 for the weekend. It was projected to make about 7 to 12, so it did exceed expectations in a sense. But again, it was made for $55 million. So again, it still is a long way off from recouping those costs. But again, if this is, I've been seeing this kind of seems almost like not quite a meme movie, but I've seen a lot of chatter about it on social media. But again, that could also be me self-selecting because the people I follow would talk about a movie like this. But it may be able to kind of hold week to week. But in addition to this 15 million domestic take, it has brought in about 25 million worldwide. So again, it's nowhere close to making back its budget yet, but hopefully maybe can keep going. Other movies opening this week, coming at number 2, Unsung Hero, like a Christian music drama film. It brought in about $7.8 million off of just a $6 million budget. So as we all know, because I've talked about it before, usually you need to you need to make double your budget just to break even to include marketing and advertising costs. So it's crossed that first threshold, but it ideally could get to 12. But with a movie like this, this might only be a limited. Not limited in terms of the amount of theaters it's in right now, but limited in terms of it might not be in theaters for week after week after week. But, this is definitely a decent... The fact that it's coming in at number 2 when you have so many huge other movies also in the top 10, that's kind of impressive. And then the only other thing opening this week, coming in at number 10, just barely squeaking in, Boy Kills World, this kind of action... high-octane movie. I've heard middling things about it. Brought in about $1.7 million. But again, this just goes to show kind of where we're at in the year right now. That this movie only brought in less than... It brought in just barely, almost $2 million. And it's still in the top 10 somehow, right? So it's clearly kind of... This calm before the storm, the box office season isn't necessarily like this. It's kind of like this. So, we were in kind of a busier period with Dune and then Godzilla and Kung Fu Panda. And now we're kind of, I think, in a little bit of a lull before we really kick things off in May with bigger films coming out. In terms of things continuing into their second week, we have Abigail and the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare coming in at 5 and 6 respectively. Abigail bringing in only 5.3 million, so this is not ideal. It dropped from second to fifth place in only its second weekend and had a 49% drop. So not the end of the world, but definitely disappointing. So far, it's brought in about 19 million domestically, 29 million worldwide, off of a $28 million budget. So again, in order ideally to double that, what would that be? 56. So it still has a little bit of a ways to go, but it may not make it there, right? This is a pretty big drop. And, we went to go see it last week. I thought it was actually pretty fun. So I'm actually a little surprised that it's not doing better. But again, maybe this just wasn't the best time of year to release it. And I'm not making this kind of reductive argument of like, it's a horror movie, so it should be released in the fall. But I don't know. Maybe I would need to look at like the historical record. Like, have horror movies opened in this time of year, and how successful have they been, right? And then again, like I said, The Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare coming in at number 6. The Guy Ritchie film only bringing in about 3.9 million, dropped from 4th to 6th in its second frame, a 57% drop. So whereas Abigail is just borderline like a huge problem, this one is, I think, a big problem. It's only so far brought in about 15 million domestically, 16 million worldwide. So a majority of its box office is happening in the United States off of a $60 million budget. So again, I don't see this. I see this being, I'll say it right now. I'm going to call it right now, flop. Big flop. Unless it really has legs, but I don't think it's going to. Just want to mention films that have been in the top 10 for over a month now. Holding number 3 in its fifth frame. It's holding third place from the previous week. Godzilla x Kong: The New Empire, bringing in 7.2 million. Only a 25% drop. And again, this has been a fairly successful film, at least in terms of the box office, though it wasn't super critically loved. It's brought in about 182 million domestically and 519 worldwide, just off of a 135 to 150 million dollar budget. So this is definitely, made back its money and then some. So this is, a big success for, I think it's Universal, right? Warner Brothers. Yeah, Warner Brothers. So there's so many, because King Kong, at least the Peter Jackson one, was distributed by Universal. So I think that's where I'm getting that from. And then we also have Kung Fu Panda coming in at number 7, only dropping from 6th to 7th in its 8th frame. So it's been out for 8 weekends now. It's still in the top 10, bringing in just a humble 3.6 million for the weekend, only a 24% drop, and similar to Godzilla x Kong, it's brought in about 185 million domestically and 504 million worldwide, off of just an $85 million budget. So this has been a very, very big success, despite most people agreeing that it's probably the worst of the Kung Fu Panda films. Excuse me. And then coming in at number 8, Ghostbusters: Frozen Empire, dropping from 7th to 8th. Oh, excuse me. I had a piece of chicken nugget stuck in my throat. Dropped from 7th to 8th in its 6th frame, only a 27% drop. Brought in about 107 million domestically, 188 million worldwide, just off of a $100 million budget. So again, if that doubling the budget rule is in effect, they're just almost there worldwide to kind of break even in a sense. And then coming in number 9, Dune Part 2. I wish it was in the top 5 for longer, but it's still, I believe, right now the highest grossing movie of the year. It dropped from 8th to 9th in its 9th frame, though. So over 2 months now, it's been in the top 10. Only a 33% drop. So again, this is just, going to be piecemeal at this point. Only bringing in, what was it, like a little less than 2 million this weekend. But every 2 million, it's 2 million they didn't have before, right? So, if it can keep kind of going, because it's made about $704 million worldwide, just off of a $190 million budget. I say just $190 million, but considering what it's made at the box office now, it is, it's like I said, it's the most successful film of the year so far. But so far, in bold, in italics, and we really don't know what the 2023 I think showed that that we're entering a new period in film history in terms of like the box office, where if you had asked someone in January 1st, 2023, what would be the big movies in terms of box office, you would not have necessarily predicted Barbie. It's certainly not Oppenheimer. You would have thought all the Marvel movies would have done super, super well, and some of them did. But it'd be a fool's errand for me to try to predict what's gonna become the highest grossing movie of the year, because I think the last year just proved we really have no idea. Okay, let's move on to our first story. Let me just grab a quick drink. All right, let's talk about story number one. So this is essentially a sequel to a story I did about a month ago. I did a huge deep dive on the TikTok ban bill that was passed by the House of Representatives. You can go check out that video on my channel. But I had erroneously predicted, like, okay, this is all for show. The House of Representatives, they're all up for re-election. They all want to seem tough on China. The Senate is not under the same constraints, and they'll probably kick the can down the road to after the election. I was wrong. I was wrong. But I wasn't wrong for the same, I was wrong, but for different reasons, right? So basically, the U.S. Senate has now, they voted last Tuesday, so about a week ago, to approve a TikTok ban, 79-18. Like I said, this was originally passed by the House of Representatives last month. I'm not going to get all into it again. You could go watch that video if you want more specific kind of explanation of all this. But essentially, this all comes from a concern over Chinese influence over, what's essentially the entree of the American media diet, or at least the media diet of, Gen Z and even millennials, like for a lot of Americans, particularly younger Americans, because TikTok is owned by ByteDance, or at least partially owned by ByteDance, which is a Chinese company, and technically under Chinese laws, China, the Chinese Communist Party could request data from ByteDance at any time for any reason, and by law they would have to turn it over. ByteDance denies that they would comply with such a law. But in any case, TikTok has become, for better or for worse, for good reason or not, has really become like a focal point in what is unfortunately seeming to be a developing Cold War between the United States and China. So the reason why I said I was wrong, but for a different reason, is that it's not like the Senate just passed a TikTok ban bill. This ended up becoming a provision of a much larger foreign aid package to Ukraine and Israel and Taiwan, which was passed in the House, and Speaker Mike Johnson, the Republican, incorporated the ban into the foreign aid bill to win Republican support for those efforts, right? So this is now the second ban that the House has passed. And so when this bill, which is primarily a foreign aid package bill, gets sent to the Senate, they're going to vote overwhelmingly for it. And this was a bipartisan supermajority. Again, across the political spectrum, minus some very, progressive people and some very kind of just sorry, not to get political, wackadoodle people all the way on the other end. No one, aside from those two extremes, no one wanted to seem soft on China, right? And this was sent to Biden, President Joe Biden, and he signed it immediately, right? There was no hemming and hawing about it, and he signaled he would sign such a bill immediately. And again, it helped that this was just a provision of a much larger foreign aid package that the Democrats have been trying to get through for months now. In contrast to the original ban that the House passed last month, ByteDance now has 9 months instead of 5 that they originally would have had. They have 9 months to now find a new buyer, and they potentially then have an extra 3-month grace period at the president's discretion. If a deal is in the works but just not completed yet. And notably, even just that 9 months, they didn't kick the can down the road. They didn't kick passing a bill or ban down the road, but they did kick the ban going into effect down the road. So 9 months from now would be, I think they calculated, because it's exactly 270 days or something. This would literally be the day before the inauguration, right? Of whether it's Joe Biden's re-inauguration or Trump's whoever it is, this would be basically right at that time. So, it's not, whereas the original bill, politicians would have had to worry about angry young voters who a month before the election lost access to TikTok. So it's very politically shrewd. And what else is politically shrewd is the inclusion of this ban as part of this larger foreign aid package. This Because if you wanted to vote for everything else, you're probably not going to not vote for it just because of this ban, right? And again, like I said, this is a huge surprise. I thought they would kick it down the road, but the House forced the Senate's hand by putting the ban into this foreign aid bill. And what's been remarked a lot in the media by both this time as well as a couple of weeks ago when the first ban was passed by the House, was the speed at which all of this happened, especially like the modern... by modern terms for like Congress actually like doing shit. This is like unprecedented how quickly this all happened. And the New York Times actually did a report that apparently a ban like this has been in the works for like nearly a year with cooperation from DOJ and the White House, and it was nicknamed internally the Thunder Run, like just trying to kind of light speed this as quickly as possible. So, like, what's going to happen now? So, TikTok is obviously going to file a legal challenge, and they've said as much. TikTok CEO of Shu Zi Chu said, quote, "Rest assured, we aren't going anywhere," end quote. Well, that remains to be seen. And TikTok's kind of stance is they view the law as a violation of First Amendment rights. Whose First Amendment rights, though? Are they arguing TikTok's First Amendment rights or the First Amendment rights of the users? So, we have a quote here from Michael Beckerman, who's TikTok's head of public policy for the Americas, saying, quote, "This is the beginning, not the end of this long process." He also criticized the TikTok divest or ban measure as, quote, "an unprecedented deal worked out between the Republican Speaker Mike Johnson and President Biden," right? Because, again, this isn't just a ban. It really is, you have 9 months to sell it or divest your interest, right? Which, notably, I believe, and TikTok has made a big point of this, I believe a majority of the stakeholders in TikTok, which is a private company, are non-Chinese. But I guess even ByteDance having a minority stake, I believe it still creates some issues. And it's not just TikTok being this argument. Like the ACLU is also kind of, trying to champion, as they are wont to do, right? The championing, the constitutional right to free speech. So we have a quote here from Jenna Leventoff, who's the senior policy counsel at the ACLU, saying, quote, "This is still nothing more than an unconstitutional ban in disguise. Banning a social media platform that hundreds of millions of Americans use to express themselves would have devastating consequences for all of our First Amendment rights and will almost certainly be struck down in court," end quote. And there is some truth to what she's saying there, right? Because there's already precedence, because a federal judge already blocked a Montana bill that would have banned the app in that state, I think last December, so maybe like 4 or 5 months ago. And the New York Times also notes that the legal, even if TikTok doesn't think it has a chance, has any hope in court, the New York Times noted here, and I think this is really interesting, that the legal back and forth could delay the app's ban, right? And they noted that potentially TikTok could just wait this out so that, if by the time a ban would happen, potentially a new president could be in the White House, a different party could be controlling the House and the Senate, so they might be able to maybe have a more sympathetic political system that could maybe reverse this or find some other kind of compromise. And again, there's a lot of really interesting legal questions here, because the Washington Post notes, I did not know about this, but it makes sense when you think about it, but it's really interesting. The Washington Post notes that the Supreme Court ruled in 1965 that American citizens have a constitutional right to foreign propaganda. And that's a big issue here, is that, there seems to be two refrains about what is the danger of China having this access. Is it what China pulls, or is it what China pushes? So, again, like I mentioned before, could China be pulling data from Americans? But then there's the concern of China pushing propagandic content, or at least content that better aligns with their geopolitical interests, right? So there's been a long, there's been some politicians who have basically said the quiet part out loud, being like, people are, all these young people are anti-Israel and protesting for pro-Palestine and all this stuff. They must be getting brainwashed by Chinese propaganda on TikTok. So I don't know about that, but that, at least according to the Washington Post, Supreme Court ruled that we have a constitutional right to foreign propaganda. Now, granted, this has never been reevaluated in like the modern digital age, but technically that is a ruling that should have, that precedence should set the standard in some ways. And also, TikTok does have some grounds here in that this bill and this ban could be argued that it could be argued that this is a bill of attainder. And what that means is it's a bill that's designed to punish a specific group of individuals. So, like, you can't make a bill that's like, John Smith can't do this. Like, you can't do that, at least from my understanding, right? So, it doesn't mention TikTok by name in the bill, but I think there was like a leaked draft of like a version of this bill, and it was literally titled like TikTok.xml or something, right? So it's very clear why this is happening. So that could be the argument. So let's say all the legal challenges fail and a ban happens. What happens next? There would be an economic impact potentially. TikTok claims that it contributed $24 billion with a B dollars to the U.S. economy in 2023, and most speculate that ByteDance is unlikely to sell its stake in TikTok, right? So the app would just become banned in the United States. It would be pulled off of app stores, and internet providers that allowed you to access it would get fined or what have you. Variety notes that Chinese officials would quote, firmly oppose, end quote, a forced sale. And supposedly they've added TikTok's algorithm to their tech export list. It would be an export that would have to receive governmental approval, which it probably would not, right? Axios also notes that like I said before, they could just wait out the election and see if the controlling party in Congress has a change of heart. And not only do people think this isn't going to happen for all the reasons I just outlined, but ByteDance has explicitly denied rumors that it was considering a sale and that they would rather just shut down their U.S. operations. So they're really playing a game of chicken here, and who's going to blink first remains to be seen. Until this happens, you still have full access to the app. Nothing's going to change. The quality of the content might change just because people start moving off of the app, like in anticipation of a potential ban. But nothing about your access to the app is going to change until no earlier than January, but probably later. And creators, my kind of take on it is that creators on TikTok, I think they're going to be outraged at first, but most of them will just, eventually them being outraged isn't going to do anything. So they're going to move over to like YouTube Shorts and Instagram Reels if they haven't already. Because again, most people are on all these platforms already. But there's still an issue because of the strength of the algorithm, and that would be lost, right? That's TikTok's secret sauce, and that's something, like I said, that would not be something that, even if ByteDance were to sell TikTok, they really would just be selling the brand, the infrastructure, and the user base, not the algorithm. And really, the algorithm is what makes TikTok, right? Vox spoke with Zari A. Taylor, who's a doctoral candidate at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And Zari A. Taylor said, basically, she explained that the algorithm is good at promoting small users with small followings to help them grow organically. That's like the whole thing, is just have the intricacies and nuances of how it promotes content to specific people, right? And the people, even if you move to YouTube Shorts and Instagram Reels, which is presentationally the same in terms of vertical video, and you're swiping between an endless stream of content, it wouldn't necessarily have the same growth opportunities because their algorithms are, at least at this time, they're different, or they're just built with different aims, right? They're not as good for growing things organically. YouTube a little bit more, but again, as I'm learning doing this YouTube channel, there's a lot of work just to grow the audience slowly. So who would buy it, right? I talked about this in my last video about a couple weeks ago. Who would buy this? Again, it's like selling Coke without the recipe, right? Or the secret recipe. So you're getting the Coke brand, but it's not going to taste the same. So like at that point, what are you paying for? Daniel Ives, who's a managing director with Wedbush Securities, said that TikTok with the algorithm could be worth up to like $100 billion. Without it, closer to maybe 30 or 40. And I think that's an overestimation. I guess they're really, because again, well, I guess it makes sense because you still get the brand and the user base and people are there. And as we've seen with Twitter has declined drastically since Elon Musk's takeover, but people are still using it, right? And it's not just like a ghost town. Like it's nothing like it was maybe like 2-3 years ago, but it's not a ghost town either. So who has enough money? Who has the cash to do this? So probably couldn't be Google or Meta for antitrust reasons, right? Because Google has YouTube Shorts and Meta has Instagram Reels. So that probably would not withstand, regulatory scrutiny, right? It could be like a private equity coalition. I know there was talks of like Steve Mnuchin, who was like the Trump's Treasury Secretary, maybe trying to build up a group of investors. There under Trump in 2020, when the whole idea of banning TikTok first kind of came to like the mainstream conversation, his original idea was to have like Microsoft or Oracle, even like Walmart, invest in it in some ways to at least remove that Chinese stake in the company. But obviously that never went through. But Microsoft could still be a viable option here because, again, they have the cash and they don't have, they don't have some kind of competitor the way Google and Meta do. And I think I read somewhere Microsoft, again, as they're building their AI models, having all access to all that data could be really, really valuable. So where do I stand on this, right? I think I've made my position kind of known here, but ultimately I think people are right when they say this is definitely a security issue, right? I'm not denying that. But the government isn't taking a stance on this because they're altruistic or for good intentions, right? They only care because China is an economic and geopolitical adversary, right? We have a quote here from Senator Mark Warner, who's a Democrat from Virginia, who's the chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, saying, quote, "We hope that TikTok will continue under new ownership, American or otherwise. It could be bought by a group from Britain, Canada, Brazil, France. It just needs to no longer be controlled by an adversary that is defined as an adversary in U.S. law," end quote. And again, it's like, okay, this is a concern potentially. Because, again, I'm very left-leaning, but I'm also no fan of the Chinese Communist Party for, like, its authoritarian measures. So, if all I know is that if we had this opportunity, like, if there was some really popular app in China that we had a stake in and we could get access, of course the intelligence community would be using it. Of course they would. So I wouldn't put it past China to do any of this, right? But it's like we should figure out our own shit first. So it's like, okay, we're so concerned about Chinese data invasions, but we have no problem with American social media companies, or better yet, the U.S. government and their surveillance of American citizens without warrant or due process. And again, it's only now that we're slowly starting as a society, maybe not society, but like the political class is starting to actually make moves in regards to American social media companies, like with Facebook. We have a quote here from Senator Ed Markey, the Democrat from Massachusetts, a very progressive Democrat, saying, quote, "Instead of suppressing speech on a single application, we could be addressing the root of the mental health crisis by targeting big tech's pernicious privacy invasion business model of teenagers and children in our country," end quote. And I completely agree. And again, it just seems like very politically motivated under this guise of like security and protecting Americans and their data and all this stuff. And again, like I mentioned before, I think a big part of this is that TikTok, more so than the other apps, are potentially more politically threatening to the political establishment. Again, with younger people being on it and being influenced, whether organically or maliciously being influenced in directions that the political establishment doesn't necessarily like. But again, I think it's a security issue, but I don't think TikTok can make an argument that this is an issue of free speech, since it's a law against the business structure of a platform, not the speech happening on that platform, right? So you can still say whatever you want, you just can't do it here. This product cannot exist the way it currently exists, right? Ultimately, like at the end of the day, I feel like I'm circling the drain here, so I'll just wrap this up. That this could be the end of TikTok if they're playing chicken and no one blinks, it'll get banned. And even if it didn't get banned and it was sold, again, it wouldn't retain the algorithm, and at that point, would it even still be TikTok? Because Chinese engineers work on that. And it just, all of this though, it's like, who knows? There's really been little to no evidence that China is doing this, though, despite what I said before, that I think they'd be stupid not to if they had the opportunity to do this. And this kind of just all feels like we're living through the McCarthy era again, right? Where this period in the 50s when Joe McCarthy is like, I have a list of 200 names of communists in the State Department, whatever. And it turned out most, if not all of those, was baloney. I think he was just holding up like a piece of paper. Like there was never any list of names. But people were freaked out about it. And I think we're going to look back at this period and kind of laugh at how paranoid everyone was about China invading, and abusing American data and all this stuff. I mean, I could be wrong, and this video will be public, and people will be able to come back to this and laugh at how wrong I was. But I think in like 30, 50 years, we're going to look back and kind of laugh at how paranoid we were during all of this, kind of like how we were in the last Cold War. And it sucks that I have to say the last Cold War. There should only be one. Well, there should have been zero, but there should only now be one, and I really hope that this isn't going to keep escalating into really scary territory. Okay, let's talk about story number 2. Let me just grab a quick drink. Okay, I know that was a long story. If you're joining us now, again, like I was saying at the beginning, feel free to drop any comments or questions in the chat. Super happy to kind of answer them as we go through, maybe kind of get a conversation going. So let's talk about story number 2. This one's a little bit shorter. So the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, has reinstated net neutrality. This was a 3-2 vote along party lines, so very predictable. And Deadline notes that the new rules resemble those established in 2015 that were repealed in 2018 under Trump's FCC. So what is net neutrality, you may be asking yourself? So essentially, net neutrality prohibits internet providers like Comcast and Verizon and AT&T from prioritizing certain types of internet traffic over others, right? So net neutrality in this decision classifies internet service providers, or ISPs. It classifies them as common carriers and therefore have to deliver their service without discrimination for the consumer or the source, right? And the source is really what's important here, that they can't basically have multi-tiers for different kinds of businesses and be like, well, if you pay extra, users will be able to access your website faster, right? Because it basically, it essentially makes it impossible for smaller websites to compete with like Walmart or this or that, at least in the terms of like being able to access the websites more easily and just faster, right? And again, this is really important because it maintains an equal internet, right? Otherwise, like I said, there would be this tiered system where smaller websites and companies wouldn't be able to compete with larger entities that could pay higher fees. They could pony up and pay that for better treatment by the internet providers, right? There have been numerous attempts to codify net neutrality into law, but none have materialized. And it... like in 2015, that would have been under Obama's administration. I remember net neutrality being a big deal. And I remember when it was repealed or reversed or overturned, however you want to put it, under Trump, I remember it was like a doomsday happening, at least the way people were talking about it. And I'm firmly in the pro net neutrality camp, but there is an argument to be made here that, opponents say net neutrality is essentially meaningless because, we had like this 5 or 6 year period where there was no net neutrality, and the dystopia that doomsday sayers were saying, that never quite came to pass. Though Deadline notes that to kind of counter that argument, to play devil's advocate to the devil's advocate here, Deadline notes that, supporters cite new state regulations that keeping service providers accountable, right? So while there wasn't a federal ruling on this, many states kind of put that framework in place to kind of keep net neutrality alive, if only by name or only in name, right? And this ruling really speaks to, it's even more important today than it was 9 years ago in 2015, because the internet is just so much more important in 2024 than it was in 2015, if that's even possible. Because I remember, in 2015 thinking the internet was everything. It feels even more, ever present and important to just the way society works, right? So we have a quote here from the FCC chair, Jessica Rosenworcel, who's pictured here, saying, quote, 4 years ago, the pandemic changed life as we know it. We were told to stay home, hunker down, and live online. It became clear that no matter who you are and where you live, you need broadband to have a fair shot at digital age success. It went from nice to have to need to have for everyone, everywhere. Broadband is now an essential service. Essential services, the ones we count on in every aspect of modern life, have some basic oversight, end quote. Could not agree more that the internet, I think when people talk about human necessities, they really just go like food and water, and maybe shelter. Again, I'm very, just admittedly, I'm very, progressive So I strongly feel that the government should provide for all basic human necessities, and that includes food, water, housing, electricity, internet. Because like she's saying, internet, you really can't function in modern society without the internet. And that's why libraries are still so important, because it's a way for people, who aren't able to afford internet or can't afford good internet or maybe unhoused and don't have like a place to have a computer and have internet. So the internet is just super important for accessing, potential finding a job or connecting. It's just important for society. So it's only natural that it should have this oversight. So as you can tell, I'm very supportive of this. I'm very much in the camp that, this should be codified into law. So it's not just on the whim of a partisan FCC, so it could just be overruled again in 5 years, and then 5 years after that, it gets put back in place. And again, internet should be considered a utility, the way that we think of electricity and water and all of those things. And there should be a lot more infrastructure and attention devoted to it. Okay, let's talk about story number 3. Let me just grab a quick drink. Okay, let's talk about story number 3 here. So AMC theaters, not the cable channel. AMC, they make movies better. If you didn't know, from the Nicole Kidman the little ad. AMC is expanding its distribution team to sign more deals with music artists for concert films. So they've hired Stephanie Terafay, pictured here, in the new position of Vice President of Distribution. She comes from Fandango, where she led an integrated marketing team. And, if you want, you can go look at her resume. She's worked at like a dozen different high-profile places in some kind of marketing role. So how does film distribution work, right? Like why am I even talking about this? Why is this important? So filmmaking, there's a lot of different ways you can break it down, but in terms of this conversation, it's really broken down into 3 steps. There's production, distribution, and exhibition. Studios today, like Disney or Warner Brothers or Universal or anything else like that, usually they handle the first 2. Production, distribution, and sometimes just distribution if they buy a film from a smaller production company, right? They used to do all 3, right? And that was like the quote unquote the golden age of Hollywood, where they made the movies, they distributed them, and they essentially owned or had very, very incestuous ties with the theaters. That was deemed unconstitutional. That was deemed monopolistic, I think, in 1948, United States versus Paramount. That basically the compromise was, okay, those are those 3 steps: production, distribution, exhibition. You can keep 2 of them, but you can't have all 3. So the studios decided to keep production and distribution, and move on, right? And to kind of take the L on that, right? So. And that's pretty much how it's been since the 40s and 50s. Really, the 50s is when that really started to go into effect, right? So, but what's interesting here is that AMC... So we've had distributors used to be exhibitors. Now we have an exhibitor who's starting to dip their toe into distribution. So this, of course, follows the success of the Eras Tour film and to a lesser extent, but still important, Beyonce's Renaissance concert film. This was during the strikes. The dual strikes from last year, going into the fall. And, artists like Swift and Beyonce, were really just the 2 of them. There's no other examples of this. But they bypassed the traditional distributors and went straight to the exhibitors, right? And they worked out specific deals. So that's really good for both AMC and Taylor Swift, for example, because now there's just one less party to have to share the money with, right? And particularly in the case of Swift, huge box office returns, right? I think the Eras Tour film made about $250 million worldwide, which is a record for a concert film. That's insane. And I believe domestically, it barely missed out on the top 10. I think it was the 11th highest grossing film domestically in 2023. But that's ridiculous for a concert film. And again, what helped the box office was it was during that drought of the strikes, where there wasn't a lot of big tentpole films being released in theaters, right? So this is kind of a continuation of a video I did, I think about a week or 2 ago, about CinemaCon, which is the theater industry's big kind of convention where they all get together and talk about how exciting the future of movie exhibition is. And I talked about in that video that, that I think things like this are really exciting. That clearly the standard, I think what COVID showed, for a time it seemed like maybe movie theaters were done. I don't think COVID, its social effect, and you could apply this to other things, like not to get on a soapbox, but like I think COVID changed society, but not in the ways people maybe thought it would at first. I think a lot of people thought the changes would be night and day. Like, so instead of going 5 days a week to the office, now everyone's going to work remote everywhere. Rather, what I think the pandemic did was force us to reconsider institutions and practices and business models that we had kind of taken for granted or have just done out of path of least resistance. It doesn't mean we're not going to keep doing those, but it forced a reckoning to be like, okay, are we just doing this because we've always done it, or what's the value here? So you're seeing that with streaming, how we thought, okay, movie theaters are going to die, everyone wants to do streaming. It turns out, financially, you need people to go to the movie theaters. You need people to watch ads on linear television, right? You need to do those things. So we're kind of coming to some kind of compromised middle ground. Same kind of thing here is that, I think this has just been a great opportunity for movie theaters to just get more experimental and just try different things. And not just the theaters, but the studios and like what they're providing, right? So like I said, I said this in my CinemaCon video, they should do more concert films like this. But also not just limit, like I don't want them to take the wrong lesson from this and like AMC and just go, we need more concert films. I don't know if it was just the concert film part. Because again, Taylor Swift and Beyonce are very unique in the industry in terms of their success and their popularity. I don't think you could just crank out a bunch of concert films and they're going to do anywhere close to what these two films did, right? Especially in a non-strike era period of the box office, right? So I don't think you can just put all your eggs in the basket of concert films. I think they should really experiment with new and interesting content that wouldn't traditionally be shown in theaters, right? So I had said, why don't they show live television broadcasts in theaters? Think about how much obviously some people would just prefer to watch the Super Bowl at home by themselves or with like a few friends, but like imagine if Game of Thrones in its final season, or final seasons if you want, imagine if every week it was playing at your theater Sunday night at the time. It wasn't shown over and over, just that one time, like the broadcast. And the theaters would pay, cut a check to HBO to do it, right? Think about how much money would have been made. Think about, because you could see that in the social media chatter after. People wanted to, there was a communal, same thing with like Succession. There's a communal aspect to shows like that. So I think theaters should adopt more unorthodox business models like that, to get more people in the theater, buy the snacks. Maybe they'll see a trailer for a movie that they weren't thinking about. And even if they saw the trailer on YouTube, when they're seeing the trailer up on the big screen with the surround sound, they might be like, I wasn't interested in that movie, but now seeing it while sitting in the theater, I'm a little bit more interested, right? But even if you just want to do the concert films, you have to make sure the concert films are good, right? You can't just sign all these deals and have all these mediocre concert films, because then the whole little mini sector industry will crash. It'll be a bubble that will burst almost immediately. Because again, what other stars have a brand like Taylor Swift? I know a lot of people have been bagging on her newest album. I've not listened to it, but from what I've heard, it is mediocre at best, and one of her worst albums at worst. But it's just, I think there's just a lot of opportunity here for people for movie theaters to be a little bit more creative with this. And again, not just take the way things have always been done, just take it at face value. Okay. Let's talk about story number 4. Let me just grab a quick drink. Okay. So this is a very disappointing story. You may have heard about this. So Emilio Garcia, pictured here, who's a former cameraman for 29-year-old Thee Stallion. I did not realize she was this young. Like, I'm only 27, so the amount of success that she's had is like insane. He was a former cameraman for Megan, Miss Thee Stallion, but he is suing her and her management group, Rock Nation, for harassment and for creating a hostile and abusive work environment. So what is this all about? So he worked for Megan Pete, which is her real name, Megan Pete, from 2018 till June 2023. He's seeking 6 figures in damages. And, you know, essentially what happened? He's claiming sexual harassment and, you know, unpaid wages and labor issues here. So I was going to talk about something else, but why don't I actually just lay out what happened here? So Garcia alleges that in 2022, he was forced to watch Megan have sex with another woman while they were in a moving vehicle in an SUV on a trip to Ibiza in Spain. So it's not like he could just get out. It was like the middle of the night in a moving vehicle in Ibiza, Spain. Garcia says, quote, "I felt uncomfortable. I was kind of frozen and I was shocked. I kind of just the overall audacity to do this right beside me," end quote. The next day, she then warned him, quote, "Don't ever discuss what you saw," end quote. And then after that incident, she treated him differently, right? So she often fat shamed him. I won't say some of the things that she said. I mean, it's not ridiculous, but it can be, you know, if you have, you know, body issues that could be triggering for you, so I won't bring that up. But often fat shamed him. And it seems like a means of controlling him psychologically. A lot of professional abusers. And by that, I mean people who use their professional status to control other people, not like they are professionals in being abusers. So some people should have those titles of how bad they are. But like this is like a classic move of like diminishing them, talking down to them, insulting them to make them feel small so that they'll stay under your thumb, right? But again, the fat shaming seems like it's really ironic, right? And Garcia even notes that here, saying, quote, "To hear someone who advocates about loving your body tell me these things, I felt degraded," end quote. And not only that, he was downgraded from his normal flat monthly rate of like $4,000, which is like not a lot to be a cameraman for, you know, like a huge hip hop superstar. So that was already not great, but he was downgraded from that flat monthly rate to being paid per task. And then of course, naturally, less requests were being made, right? And furthermore, he was classified as an independent contractor, so he lost out on health benefits. And then eventually this all bubbled over. He was let go by Roc Nation the next year in 2023 as retaliation for complaining about wage and hour issues. He even brought the concerns up to Megan's makeup artist the night before and about how he was considering leaving. So it seems like Roc Nation kind of jumped the gun and fired him or let him go, that we no longer require your services or what have you. And, you know, now he's saying that he suffers from, quote, "mounting anxiety, depression, and physical distress," end quote. We have a quote here. We have another quote from Garcia's attorney, Ron Zambrano, saying, quote, "Megan just needs to pay our client what he's due, own up to her behavior, and quit this sort of sexual harassment and fat shaming conduct. Emilio should never have been put in the position to having to be in the vehicle with her while she had sex with another woman. Inappropriate is putting it lightly. Exposing this behavior to employees is definitely illegal," end quote. And Deadline also notes that Zambrano has represented several of Lizzo's tour dancers who are suing her for sexual harassment and discrimination and illegal retaliatory termination. Megan's attorney, Alex Spiro, basically, their response was framing it like, okay, we'll hash out all these labor issues in court, but this whole thing about sexual harassment, you know, seems like overkill, and you're just doing it to get more media attention, which may be true, but, you know, you need more media attention to sometimes have things have momentum like this. So we have a quote here from attorney Alex Spiro saying, quote, "This is an employment claim for money, with no sexual harassment claim filed and with salacious accusations to attempt to embarrass her. We will deal with this in court," end quote. Deadline notes Spiro was also one of Harvey Weinstein's attorneys for a number of years, so that might give you a sense of where he's coming from. He's also currently on Alec Baldwin's defense team for the Rust manslaughter case, right? And again, he's claiming that the real issue is labor and the sexual harassment allegations are just being used to embarrass Megan Thee Stallion. But then Garcia's attorney, Zambrano, retorts saying, quote, "It's an utter lie that we have not alleged a hostile work environment based on the sex claim. It is literally the first claim listed in the lawsuit. None of this is intended to embarrass her, but merely an attempt to hold her accountable for her illegal actions, just as anyone else should be, celebrity or not," end quote. So this whole affair is just really disappointing, right? It just goes to show that people in power, you know what I mean? It is right. The way we've designed our hierarchical structures in society, and this is like a really big comment I'm making. So it's not like I can point to someone and be like, this is your fault that this is this way. But, you know, as a society, we create the conditions where things like this can happen all the time. And, you know, it's for a long time, especially once the Me Too movement kind of started up, you know, rightfully so, right? I think there was this refrain that, you know, these abusers, it's always these old straight white men. And that was true, but it wasn't because they were somehow they were exclusively more prone to abusing power. It was just because they were the defining group that historically held all of the power for centuries, right? So people of other communities didn't have a chance to abuse power, right? So again, that's like what we're seeing here, right? So again, Megan Thee Stallion's very successful. You know, obviously her big breakout, Hot Girl Summer, and then Savage is where I first heard her during the pandemic, which then got like a Beyonce remix. So, you know, she's a very prominent person. This isn't like some petty, low-level thing. And, you know, it's like this political cartoon that I always reference to people when talking about these kind of issues. It's like this picture of these people in the Middle East, and there's like a drone about to bomb them. And one of them says to the other, and it's like, but it's okay because it's a woman this time. America elected a woman. And it's like, wow, but it really makes you feel like you're part of history, right? There's this idea that like, okay, you can gender swap and race swap all these different positions of power, but, you know, if the fundamental approach is still the same, the same kind of horrors and problems are going to persist. So it's disappointing that, you know, if a black queer woman is also prone to this potential abuse of authority, then it speaks to our broken power structures, right? At the same time, not to excuse any of this, at the same time, she's 29, you know, and that's not young. It's not like she's 12, you know, she's an adult. But, you know, that's a lot of power and authority and responsibility given to you at a very young age, and most 29-year-olds that I would know would also fuck that up. So, again, I'm not saying she's some uniquely evil person, but again, it just speaks to the way we grant power and authority to people in society, in the world. We live in a society. But again, aside from all the sexual harassment stuff, again, this does seem to be mostly a labor issue. Again, I wouldn't say that the sexual harassment stuff is inconsequential, because clearly that was the impetus for all of these labor issues happening. So again, issues here like unpaid wages, illegal contractor classification, and most notably illegal retaliatory termination. Apparently, some other details here: he was denied legally required breaks for meals. He worked over 50 hours a week. So again, that 4,000 flat rate that he was originally getting, I was like, okay, that's good. It depends on how many hours he's working. 4,000 a week is like 1,000 a month. Well, let's do some math. So let's see. So 4,000. Let's say you were working normal 40 hours a week. So let's say there's 4 weeks so divided by 4, so 1,000 a week divided by 5, so 200 a day divided by 8 hours. So you're making like 25 an hour, which is good. It's more than I make right now in my full-time job. But for Megan Thee Stallion, hip-hop phenomenon, that seems, again, just ridiculous. And again, not only would he work 50 hours a week, but Megan would supposedly contact him at any and all hours, right? He wasn't allowed to work for anyone else. He needed to be on standby 24/7. And there's also this question of, you know, Megan may not have even known he was in the car, because, you know, the Daily Beast notes that Garcia's statement implies that she wasn't sure, right? Because she basically was going around the next day being like, were you in the car last night when that happened, right? So that would imply like, okay, maybe Megan didn't intentionally do this. She didn't know he was in the car. But again, it's like an SUV. Like, it's not, like, how would you not know that he's in the car with you unless you were all like completely plastered or completely, was it stoned, right? But Garcia's attorney Zambrano says that you know, this was her going around asking if he was in the car was strategic on her part, right? And this is it's funny, but like, it shouldn't be funny, but just like the way he frames it. really, kind of brings this to light. So he said, quote, "You think she just guessed correctly to ask the one person that was there? Did she go around asking everybody in her camp if they happened to have been in the car while she was having sex that night? She remembered and took steps to try to intimidate him to stay quiet," end quote. And I agree with that, where it's like, I think you definitely knew he was in the car. And, you going around to ask was to, like, see if he would say no, like hoping he would maybe be like, "Oh no," like even though you both knew he was there, just kind of suss out like where is he kind of coming from here. So again, this is really disappointing. I try not to do like oops, sorry, I accidentally cut to the next story. Sorry. I usually try not to do like tabloidy stories like this, but again, I think this is an interesting reflection of the entertainment industry and abuses of power. And I feel bad again focusing on her as a up-and-coming black woman, and also Lizzo, right? I don't... Because I think sometimes people will also focus on them to discredit, like, basically, like, focus more on them because they're black women, and that's not fair. But again, I think this is just an interesting story, no matter how you slice it. Okay, let me just grab a quick drink before moving on. Okay. Speaking of Me Too stuff, let's talk about story number 5. So 72-year-old Harvey Weinstein, his 2020 rape conviction in the state of New York has been overturned by a court of appeals. He was originally found guilty of sexually assaulting Miriam Haley, a former production assistant on Project One Way at his apartment in 2006. And when he was found guilty of this, he was sentenced to 23 years in prison, which is where he has been. Right, he's been behind bars. But this New York Court of Appeals has overturned this. It was a 4-3 ruling, and this ruling found that the judge in the original trial had shown prejudice by allowing women to testify about allegations unrelated to the case, right? So this is like what's called, it's like a French word. It must mean something, but I didn't have time to look into this. But a molyneux witness? Essentially where it's like you bring in these witnesses that have allegations against the defendant, to show a pattern, right? And we have the judge here, Judge Jenny Rivera, who wrote in the majority opinion of this overturning of this conviction, saying, quote, "It is an abuse of judicial discretion to permit untested allegations of nothing more than bad behavior that destroys the defendant's character, but sheds no light on their credibility as related to the criminal charges lodged against them," end quote. So this idea that it's like, okay, that's all great, but these are all allegations that the defendant has not been charged, has not been convicted of, let alone charged with. So essentially they're inadmissible. We do have the dissenting opinion from Judge Madeline Singas saying, quote, "With today's decision, this court continues to thwart the steady gain survivors of sexual violence have fought for in our criminal justice system. Forgotten are the women who bear the psychological trauma of sexual violence and the scars of testifying again and again. This erosion of precedent, born from a refusal to accept that crimes of sexual violence are far more nuanced and complex than other crimes, comes at the expense and safety of women," end quote. And this was also another quote we have here from Judge Singas saying, quote, "Men who serially sexually exploit their power over women, especially the most vulnerable groups in society, will reap the benefits of today's decision. Under the majority's logic, instances in which a trafficker repeatedly leverages workers' undocumented status to coerce them into sex, or a restaurant manager withholding tips from his employees unless they perform sexual acts, becomes a series of individual credibility contests and unrelated misunderstandings. After today's holding, juries will remain in the dark about, and defendants will be insulated from past criminal acts, even after putting intent at issue by claiming consent," end quote. So I know that was a long thing, but I think that really sums up the dissenting opinion here, and that, this may be a rule, but maybe we need to change the rules here for sexual crimes, because they're just, the nature of them is different, right? Because a murder happened or it didn't happen, right? Whereas an act of sexual interaction, there's 2 levels to it. Did it happen? And then was it consensual or not, right? So there needs to be like different kind of safeguards around, charging and trying people for these kinds of crimes, right? Though, notably though, the LA Times notes that this Court of Appeals is predominantly, a female, right? So this isn't like a bunch of old white dudes who are making this decision and don't understand what it's like to be a woman, right? This isn't necessarily a ridiculous legal argument, though. And actually, the New York Times ran an article recently titled, quote, Harvey Weinstein's conviction was fragile from the start. And it was written by Jodi Kantor, who, with Megan Twohey, broke the original story about Weinstein in the Times. She writes, quote, in this article, writes, quote, the overturning of Harvey Weinstein's New York sex crimes conviction on Thursday morning may feel like a shocking reversal, but the criminal case against him has been fragile since the day it was filed. Prosecutors moved it forward with risky, boundary-pushing bets, end quote. So, her, I mean, obviously she's no fan of Harvey Weinstein, but her argument was that he ended up being convicted. It was very faulty to begin with, and that it was shaky, and it was ripe for some kind of appeal like this. So, unfortunately, a new trial must take place, right? And we have a quote from the spokesperson for the Manhattan DA saying, quote, we will do everything in our power to retry this case and remain steadfast in our commitment to survivors of sexual assault, end quote. Now, you might be saying, this is awful. Harvey Weinstein's going to be roaming free. That's not the case. He will still be in jail because he was also, while he was already in jail in New York, he was convicted in LA in 2022 and sentenced to 16 years in prison. That conviction could potentially be appealed now because his conviction in New York was used as part of the argument in the LA case, right? So, I could see an appeal being made like, well, one of the big reasons why he was convicted in LA was because he had already been convicted in New York, but that has now been overturned. So shouldn't this one be as well? But the thing, though, about the California case is that California and New York have different laws regarding admitting, testimony like that of other allegations. And California explicitly allows what's called prior bad acts evidence or testimony. And we have a quote here from the LA DA's office saying, quote, although we do not know what arguments the defense will raise on appeal, we are confident that our convictions will withstand appellate scrutiny. Our office stands ready to see that Mr. Weinstein faces the serious consequences of his deplorable conduct, end quote. So what is this all about, right? I've been going on. Most of you probably know, but I think just so we're all on the same page. So Harvey Weinstein was just a behemoth and an icon, or giant, maybe is the better word, in the independent movie world, right? He produced Shakespeare in Love and essentially created the modern idea of like the Oscar campaign, right? So notably Shakespeare in Love through kind of, industry, political, sweet talking and maneuvering, Shakespeare in Love ended up winning Best Picture that year instead of Saving Private Ryan, which was like the favorite. And obviously the better film and the one that people still actually like. 25-ish years later, right? But he's also executive produced countless other classic films, like most of Quentin Tarantino's work. Also was one of the executive producers on the Lord of the Rings trilogy, the Scream franchise, Good Will Hunting, Paddington, The King's Speech, which kind of feels like another Shakespeare in Love, where it's like it's a good movie, but The Social Network should have won that year. Now, all of this going on, though, over decades, it was an open secret that Weinstein was creepy at best and a sexual predator at worst, right? And he used his power and influence to intimidate women into sexual favors and then keeping them quiet, right? And there were these accounts of dozens and dozens of women over the years who crossed paths with him and shared similar experiences of intimidation, harassment, and abuse, right? And he really became the face of the Me Too movement. Or rather, that makes it sound like he was leading the charge. He became like the main villain, right? The main antagonist of that movement. And the face of cancel culture when all of this kind of broke in late 2017. Like I mentioned before, the New York Times, I think Ronan Farrow had broken a story as well, but it really all broke open when the New York Times broke a story that detailed decades of abuse. And Weinstein apologized, but maintained his innocence and claimed that, everything was consensual. And this, just if you remember, you may be watching, you might be too young to remember this, but, this began an onslaught of breaking news every day with new allegations about your favorite celebrity. So, it would one day it'd be Kevin Spacey, and then Matt Lauer, and then John Lasseter from Pixar. And it just every day seemed like a new person that you admired or looked up to or just had interest in was actually this awful person, right? And I was in film school at the time. I was a junior. So, especially since the Me Too movement spread across essentially all of society, but it originated in the film industry. And that seemed to be where a huge focus of it was. So in film school, we talked about this probably every single day for weeks. as we should have, right? And I think this was really important that this movement happened because it really brought, a deeper understanding from, it really helped well-meaning but oblivious men like myself have a deeper understanding of the dangers that every woman faces. Like, the hashtag Me Too, that was that's not just a phrase. Like, it was like every woman that you knew was posting something about it on social media saying, like, I've had an experience. And it just, I'm not saying like, well, we didn't know anything about it. Like, we should have known. And we should have been more sensitive to this. But it was kind of like, I think, for white people, again, like myself, I'm not immune to any of this, and I'm willing to admit my own flaws here, right? I think kind of similar to the George Floyd protest in 2020. Like, we knew it was bad, but it didn't quite dawn on us yet. That was a very generationally transformative moment. And this was no exception when it came to gender issues and just safety, workplace safety, because that's ultimately what this all amounts to. So Weinstein basically became vilified and was essentially ostracized from the industry in all of public life. Like, he basically became a recluse. So obviously people have very strong reactions about this overturning of this conviction. So, people like Douglas Wigdor, who's an attorney who represented 2 pre-trial witnesses in New York, saying, quote, "Today's decision is a major step back in holding those accountable for acts of sexual violence. Courts routinely admit evidence of other uncharged acts where they assist juries in understanding issues concerning the intent, modus operandi, or scheme of the defendant. The jury was instructed on the relevance of this testimony, and overturning the verdict is tragic in that it will require the victims to endure yet another trial," end quote. We also have a quote here from Silence Breakers, which is a group that includes Ashley Judd and Rose McGowan, 2 of Weinstein's most kind of visible victims. The group Silence Breakers said, quote, "The news today is not only disheartening, but it is profoundly unjust. But this ruling does not diminish the validity of our experiences or our truth. It's merely a setback. When survivors everywhere broke their silence in 2017, the world changed. We continue to stand strong and advocate for that change. We will continue to fight for justice for survivors everywhere." So that's the majority opinion by most people. Again, like, you're gonna be hard pressed. Even people who are like, "Oh, everything's so woke and you can't say anything to a woman now," all this stuff. Even they agree Harvey Weinstein's a scumbag. Like, I don't think there's anyone who's in support of him. But there are a few, right? So we have a quote here from Weinstein's lawyer, Arthur Aidala, who was his lawyer in this appellate case, saying, quote, "We all worked very hard, and this is a tremendous victory for every criminal defendant in the state of New York," end quote. Okay. And we also have a quote here from Weinstein spokesperson Judah Engelmeyer saying, quote, "We're studying the appeal and we don't know the full ramifications of it yet. Harvey doesn't know about the ruling yet. We can't call him in jail. He can only call us. We've emailed him. His lawyers have emailed him, but he hasn't yet responded. His team is cautiously excited," end quote. But eventually he did find out, Weinstein did, and he reportedly cried tears of joy when he heard the news and just kept saying, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." Probably because he's like, "Shit, I gotta get the fuck out of here," right? And reportedly he's looking forward to leaving, his minimum security prison in New York State and heading back to New York City. He's still going to be held. Again, he's not just going to be roaming around. He's still going to be held for retrial. He's set to make a court appearance this Wednesday on May 1st. And he's probably excited about this because the dude is suffering from some health problems. He's got heart problems, sleep apnea, diabetes, rotting teeth. He's legally blind. And I think once he was released, he was admitted to Bellevue Hospital, and they were just like, "This dude's a fucking mess," right? So I think I've made how I feel about this pretty clear. Again, this is very disappointing. But again, at least based off of the way New York laws are currently structured, this is legally sound, right? Technicalities are annoying and inconvenient, but they do matter, right? The man is 100% guilty, right? And again, my kind of view on, sexual harassment, assault, or rape allegations is, we do have an innocent until proven guilty legal system. But that being said, usually if there's a pattern, the more unconnected people make similar allegations, the more likely these allegations are true. If it was just one person, then you can maybe argue. But honestly, once you even get up to 2 unrelated people make the same allegation against someone, usually that indicates a pattern, right? It reinforces the truth of these allegations, right? And again, this isn't the end of the world because he's still going to be in jail. Again, the LA conviction is probably not going to be overturned, and he's 72. He's in horrible health. I don't see the dude living another 16 years, right? But I do understand the potential legal ramifications. It sets a precedent, right? And it's a matter of principle that, it speaks like I think who was it, the judge who wrote the dissenting opinion, that basically this basically empowers other defendants with similar charges going forward, right? But again, it's inconvenient and really frustrating and disappointing, but this does show the virtue of an impartial judicial system, which we have a very fucked up judicial system in the United States, but there is something at its core that, that this has value in that, innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And if the judge allowed such testimony, then the judge should have known better, right? And, we have a quote here from Daniel Medwed, who is a professor of law and criminal justice at Northeastern University in Boston, saying, quote, "You could think of New York as a dinosaur in terms of its laws about not admitting testimony like this. You could think of New York as a dinosaur, but I think of it as New York being very vigilant of protecting the civil rights of defendants. It's a traditional view, maybe it's a lingering civil libertarian view, that the jury punishes someone not for who they are alleged to be, but what they've done in this case. Loosening the rules of evidence could be a slippery slope to an erosion of all of our rights," end quote. Slippery slope arguments are oftentimes flawed because they're not even the same slope. They'll be like, "Oh, if we do this, then this will happen." And I'm like, well, those aren't necessarily logically connected. You just think they might be. But I think, again, to a point, I kind of agree with this guy here that, ultimately Harvey Weinstein has the same rights as everybody else. And ultimately his rights were technically under New York law. They were trampled. So this is disappointing. It's going to be disappointing because now there's going to have to be another trial, and witnesses have to decide if they want to re-testify, and that could be really traumatizing for them. But again, this whole kind of thing just kind of speaks to, are we in the end of cancel culture? Again, no one's excited and accepting Harvey Weinstein with open arms again. But again, that movement seems so potent for so long. And again, to a point, it may have been an overcorrection at times, but again, it was a necessary overcorrection. That you needed to have the overcorrection so you can then kind of settle into where you need to be, right? But with something like the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard case, that seemed like a huge turning point, where again, the power had been shifted back to abusers, or at least alleged abusers, right? Just to be fair. But again, is this another huge turning point? Again, Bill Cosby had his conviction overturned, also on a technicality, though a different technicality. So again, I think these prosecutors just need to do a better job and stop using dubious legal methods and just do it so that it is ironclad, so we don't have issues like this again. But only time will tell. I'm sure even without those extra pieces of testimony, he's still going to be found guilty. And if not, he's going to LA. So it's either, where do you want to be in jail? Do you want to be in LA or upstate New York? So only time will tell with that. Okay, let's just start wrapping up the show. Let me just grab a quick drink here. So looking ahead to the box office this upcoming weekend, we got The Fall Guy, projected to come in around 30 to 40 million. I'm actually kind of excited for this. This is directed by the guy who did Bullet Train, which was not a great film, but I thought it was really, really fun. And the trailer seems fun, and Ryan Gosling is obviously on a hot streak right now, so I think this is going to be a lot of fun. And it'll be interesting, if it's able to meet these expectations. And then we also have Tarot, a horror film. It doesn't look very good, and I don't think it's going to be very good. It's tracking to have a very small opening, around 5 to 8 million. Okay, I just want to give a shout out to the best film I watched this week. This could be a film that I've seen a million times. It could be a film I've seen for the first time. It could have come out 100 years ago. It could have come out yesterday. Whatever the best film I watched this past week, I want to give a shout out. And that was the film Nowhere Special. Super heartbreaking film about, it's not really a spoiler because it's the whole premise of the movie. This dad pictured here has cancer, and he's a single dad. So he's basically using his last weeks and months alive to try to find a new parents or new family for his young son, also pictured here. It was really touching and really sweet. I think it's having a pretty limited release, but if you are able to go see it, I would highly recommend. Okay, so that's basically the end of the show. Just want to give a few quick plugs. This is not my only YouTube channel. I have a sister channel called Peter Squared. where I cover topics related to film and media entertainment in a more written video essay format. The video I have up now is called A Closer Look at Frozen, where, you guessed it, I take a closer look at the Disney film Frozen, and kind of take a look at what went right, what went wrong, and everything in between, using these two cartoon versions of my younger and older self. You can find the link in the description below. It'd be a huge help if you could go check that out and subscribe. Also want to plug a podcast I do with my fiance Viviana called Now That's Why I Call It Franchise, where we pick a film franchise and we go through every single installment. The good, the bad, and the ugly. We just wrapped up our season on the Batman franchise, so you can go back and listen to all those. In the coming weeks, we're going to get started on doing the Addams Family franchise. You can listen wherever you get your podcasts, as you can see here. You can also find us on YouTube. We also have the podcast is also being streamed on YouTube. But you can also just find the link in the description down below. It'd be a huge help if you could go check that out. And then finally, Cinema QSO is not just a YouTube channel. It started as, and still is, a Substack newsletter where I write more formal written reviews of new movies coming out, like Nowhere Special, like I mentioned before. And it's an opportunity for me to kind of have more writerly analysis of some of these new movies. So would highly recommend you go check that out. It really would be a huge help. Again, you can find that in the link below, in the description below, or just going to your web browser and typing in cinemanqso.substack.com. That's it for this week. I'm Peter Mancuso. Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't already, please like this live stream. It really helps with the YouTube algorithm. If you're watching this and you haven't subscribed, smash that subscribe button, as they say. And I hope you have a good rest of your week. I'll talk to you next time. Peace out.